Hello, it's Adam in the Newscast studio.
And it's Chris in the studio.
And it's Alex in the studio.
And Faisal too here in the studio.
Alex, at Westminster is being dominated by this growing, massive backbench rebellion in the Labour Party against the government's welfare reforms, which are supposed to be in Parliament for having their first actual vote on them, even though, as we always say, it's confusingly called the second reading on Tuesday. First of all, just give us a sense of the scale of this phenomenon.
Do you mean the scale of the potential rebellion?
Yes.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's really important to say that sometimes when this kind of thing happens and there's a bit of a fracturing or a splintering within a party and MPs get unhappy with each other, it can feel like it's all a bit what they call the Westminster bubble, i.e. kind of, we're all getting overexcited about natural disagreements between people who have a different view on things. I don't think this is that, and I don't think this is that for a couple of reasons. The first thing is that this is a significant policy for the government, their welfare reform package, where they want to curb the rate of spending on sickness and disability benefits in particular. So this is quite a key bit of legislation for them that they kind of need to get through. The second thing is the scale of the unhappiness within the Labour Party about this. So over 120 MPs have put their names to paper to say we do not agree with what the government's doing here, particularly around cutting disability benefits. And we don't agree to the extent they will say so publicly, and they were prepared to effectively kill this whole piece of legislation.
And Chris, on Thursday's podcast episode of Newscast, which you can listen to on BBC Sounds, I spoke to Luke Sullivan, who not only used to be an advisor to Keir Starmer, but used to be an advisor to the Labour chief whip, so the person who's meant to get these votes through and prevent these things happening. And he said a lot of interesting things, the big thing being actually for a lot of Labour backbenchers, the welfare system is as much a matter of conscience as like assisted dying is last week when we were talking about that. And the second thing he said was, OK, there's all this focus on what could Number of 10 have done. But he said this is a very organised, massive rebellion campaign against this legislation by these Labour MPs.
Yeah, it's been incredibly well organised. It's incredibly broad, not just in number, but by political instinct and background. It includes newbies. It includes long-standing Labour MPs. It includes those who see themselves as on the left of the Labour Party, those in the middle, those on the, if you like, the right of the Labour Party. And the numbers are massive. And picking up on Alex's point, to commit your name to paper in the way that they have chosen to do is a really big deal. Parliamentary paper, not just whispering to journalists in the tea room or in the in Parliament, not just writing a piece in a newspaper, but actually saying you think that this legislation should be stopped.
And that's not just us exaggerating the drama. That is actually what it is like at Westminster.
Yeah, you're completely that. And therefore forcing the government into a situation where it had to change. It could not possibly do nothing, because that would mean defeat. So what's happening right now as we record, and who knows by the time you're watching or listening to this where we might get to, so things are moving, they are in retreat. They're in reverse, they've crunched into reverse, the white light of the reversing light is on, and they are moving backwards. And the question is, how far back do they go? And so how far back do they go with their planned welfare changes? How much of them remain intact and in what form? Where does that leave the Prime Minister's authority? And then where does it leave the Treasury's spreadsheets? Because at least part of the motivation, and a significant part of the motivation behind this, was the idea that by the end of the Parliament, you'd save £5 billion a year. Well, what's left of that £5 billion by the time these reverses have been completed?
And I should say we're recording this episode of Newscast at 7:15. So if you know more about what's happened than we do, then we hope that it's all unfolded in a very clearly explained manner by Chris in the future on the 10 o'clock news, which you've just seen. Whoa. Alex, there's been so much speculation Wednesday night into Thursday about where actually any compromises or tweaks could be. What have you heard?
So I think one of the areas that they're looking at very clearly, because it is an area that has been of most pressing concern to many of the Labour MPs who've raised concerns about this, is to do with the eligibility of personal independence payments.
Yeah.
So these are the payments that go to disabled people who need extra help with the costs of living their lives because of their disabilities. And they're not means tested, and they are not dependent on whether or not you are in work. But the government was proposing to change the eligibility for those payments to effectively make it harder for you to qualify to get what's called PIP payments. And I think that is an area that's really ripe for the government to look at, because that is one of the key areas that Labour MPs were talking about. Because, the truth of it is there are a lot of Labour MPs who accept the government's argument that when you look at the spreadsheets, and I always mention spreadsheets with a bit of caution sitting opposite Faisal, but when you look at the spreadsheets and the trajectory of expected spending on sickness and disability benefits, which is going up and up and up and up according to the predictions, there's a lot of Labour MPs that recognise the argument that it's maybe better for people to be helped and supported into work. The problem was they thought the approach the government had taken was completely the wrong one.
Do you think because it's a big package of stuff with lots of dials being tweaked up and down and things being set, and there's a lot of scope to make changes?
There is, yeah. And I think I'm conscious that when we're telling the story, there's the political drama elements of the story, and then there's the specifics, which we don't have yet, that will affect hundreds of thousands, potentially millions of people. And until the government is committed to a new position and then sufficiently confident it can get it through, and then we find out, should the vote happen as expected next Tuesday, how this might be experienced by people, we will not.
Oh yeah, I was doing a phone-in
sure
on Radio 2 today, and a woman called Tricia phoned in. She's like, "Oh, I'm on PIP. What's going to happen to my PIP?" And I was like, "Well, this is what the government set out in their plans, but we actually don't know what they're going to end up with." And I said to her at the end, I was like, "Actually, how do you think you'll find out what the plans are?" She's like, "I'll just have to go to Citizens Advice and get them to."
And that's the real world reality beyond the political noise. And to be fair, when I speak to people in government, they are aware of that. They're aware that this involves, people who are worried about what their bank balance is going to look like, and are now seeing this turbulence where already there was some uncertainty, and now there could be more. Two little things to chip in, again, subject to being overtaken by events.
By yourself.
One is that, as Alex was saying, the government thinks that movement on personal independence payment is the way to reassure the biggest chunk of currently disgruntled Labour MPs. That's not to say there aren't those worried about the health elements of universal credit or carers allowance or other elements of it, but that's the biggest element.
And that would have, because these changes are going to affect 800,000 claimants in that.
Exactly. And then the other thing that I was quite surprised by, and of course, amongst a bunch of potential rebels that is as broad as it is, no one person speaks for all of them. Some of them will merely speak for themselves. But speaking to someone who has been in the heart of organising this, who was saying to me 24 hours ago that they weren't sure there would be enough scope for concessions to persuade enough people to back down. This person was saying to me this evening that they now thought that there might be.
I think the origin story of this is really important. In fact, I think the crux of this for me is that the government says that this is a reform package. And I think the Green Paper, Liz Kendall's Green Paper, was meant to be a reform package of getting all those people back into work so that the bill comes down. And I think there's just widespread consensus on that with the rebels, within the Labour Party, with the opposition, actually, that that's the right way. It's good for the taxpayers, it's good for the economy, it's good for the actual individual.
Why they were going to spend £1 billion on back into work programmes.
Well, see, but this is the issue. What happened in March, and we all know this, was that a gap opened up in the budget numbers from the non-negotiable budget rules of the Chancellor. And interestingly, what's the origin story of that? It's because borrowing costs went up basically around the world, mainly because Donald Trump's tariff war. So you have that messes up the budget numbers. They've chosen to sort of make that cut every 6 months. A gap opens up and they suddenly say, let's have the Green Paper, the consultation paper, and let's make a saving. But we need to make that saving score in the spreadsheet. And so in order to make it score, we need to make a cut that is very real, that the OBR will believe.
£4.5 billion.
So that is essential, and the bulk of that is the PIP cut. So that is why you have to do this. Technically speaking, they up the eligibility criteria to kind of like a more severe form of disability that qualifies for 4 points on their own spreadsheet. And then that scores as a saving by the end of the parliament. And then that means the gap closes. And so it becomes more of a short-term savings spending cut than welfare reform.
As opposed to let's approach this whole issue differently in a way that works better for everyone.
Yes, we do want the bill to go down. Let's take that money. And this is the point. This is very tough stuff. You're talking about people for whom it's a challenge to get into the workforce, if they are in the workforce. And often the way to do that is to sort of some sort of middle ground, part-time work, things like that. And it requires money. And that's how it's worked in the past. Indeed, there are echoes of this argument in what happened a decade ago when Ian Duncan Smith resigned because George Osborne wanted to take away some of this middle ground in the benefits system. So I think that is the absolute crux of this. And there is some big irony and fundamental question here, because in trying to pursue economic credibility through these all-important rules that are judged by the Office of Budget Responsibility, you're closing this gap every 6 months, responding to what's happening all around the world. But she's come up with a policy that doesn't appear she can get through Parliament. And so what is your credibility as a Chancellor? Yes, it's making sure your numbers add up, but it's also when you stand up that your policies are going to get through Parliament, which you just kind of expect when you've got a majority of 160. So there's a problem. And there's a real balancing, there's a sort of credibility abacus here of like, okay, I can make it add up every 6 months, but oh dear, don't seem to be a policy I can't actually get through.
Sorry, Alex, you were
I was just
going
going to say, I think Faisal's completely right about this is why there is a real consequence to this. There's clearly a consequence for the people who receive these benefits. There's clearly a consequence for the Prime Minister's authority to what Chris says. But there's a kind of bigger question here, which is that's part of the narrative we've had from this government since before the election and consistently through is we have to take difficult decisions to get the public finances in order. And Rachel Reeves has very much self-styled herself as the Chancellor who's prepared to stick to the fiscal rules and take those tough decisions. But they are now butting up against when they are attempting to do it, whether it's winter fuel or in this instance, welfare, a parliamentary Labour Party that is pushing back hard and is prepared to really go to the wire on it, as we're seeing in this example. So the big question for the government beyond whatever happens with these welfare reforms is what do you do? What do they now do when they are saying they want to and have to make difficult economic choices and they've got a Labour Party that is quite clearly emboldened to say, hang about, we don't like it.
But the sequencing really does matter. And this is really pretty interesting. You have actually some of the experts think we blame the pandemic for the run-up of ill health and benefit claimants. But actually, it starts 10 years ago. Some of the experts think it starts with that reform that Ian Duncan Smith warned about.
Oh, because that sort of incentivized people to sort of claim more. Or
so this is the thing. You take it away from people and then they say, well, do you know what? I do have this incapacity. I am disabled. If that's the only way to keep some sort of support, that is the incentive structure. And that is the fear even about these reforms too, that people who were on 2 points will now say, well, actually, I do qualify for the 4 points.
And also so much of it went to being done over the phone rather than people seeing each other face to face. There's so many ingredients to this.
This is a policy affecting 800,000 people. If you take the wider package, maybe 1.5 million.
Some of whom will lose £4,000 or maybe even 10,000.
You're talking hundreds of thousands of people losing thousands of pounds a year. They are all going to notice. There's 1,000 or 2,000 in every constituency. I would say hundreds of them will be writing to their MP.
And what was it Diane Abbott said to you on Newsnight the other night? She said in some Labour constituencies, the number of people on PIP is much bigger than the Labour MP's majority. So actually, it's more important to think about the number of people on PIP in your constituency than actually the number of people who voted for you.
Exactly. But I think underlying this is a fundamental judgment, which is the run-up in ill health that we have seen over since the pandemic, since maybe before the pandemic. Do our politicians believe that it's real? Or do they not believe it's real? Do they believe it's like attitudes that can be solved by pulling away benefits? Or do they accept? I mean, we were told there needs to be parity between mental health and physical health. If that's the truth, and there are now more mentally ill people, then does government, does the state grow and fund that? Or does the state have a conversation, like an honest conversation, and say, we can't actually afford to accommodate this run-up in mental ill health and physical ill health in the benefit system.
And former Chancellor Jeremy Hunt was sat in that very seat where Chris is sitting a couple of weeks ago doing an episode of Newscast where he said, when I was Health Secretary, I was the one that pushed for parity of esteem, as it's called, between physical and mental health. And he said, I didn't realise one of the consequences would be the benefits bill would go through the roof.
And you put all of those things together to the now, and you've got a Labour government, even with a colossal majority, struggling. And perhaps, it's always more likely for a government of the left to struggle with this because of how so many Labour MPs will self-define in terms of what the core of their political being is. And around some of this stuff, as the numbers have proven this week, they simply cannot possibly accept it. And so even with such a big majority, you have all of these problems that have accumulated, and a particular flavour of government that is perhaps less suited than others might be to be able to take it on because of the politics that they face internally.
And then the pressures on what the government spends its money on increased again this week, right in front of your eyes at the NATO summit in The Hague, where Keir Starmer signed up to eventually spending 5% of national income on defence.
Yeah.
So that's another, I think that's ultimately an extra 30 billion a year.
Yeah, tens of billions a year. So you throw that into the pot alongside just this sort of landscape of the welfare state over the last 10 years, the international picture of one where he, alongside other leaders, signing up to, albeit this commitment that is at least 2 general elections down the track, and who is Prime Minister and what party's in government by then, who knows? But that basic acceptance and that argument that began under Rishi Sunak and has continued, that our collective European defence posture is going to have to be much more muscular, i.e. more expensive. And my goodness, yet another challenge in the context of growth where it is, where the tax burden is, where the welfare state is. These are massive conundrums for this government and its successor to wrestle with, and then doing it in this febrile political environment where a majority of 160 does not shield you in year one from a colossal, spectacular rebellion blowing up in your face.
It does also make me think we just need to maybe reconfigure our timelines of political parties and governments. And actually, I wonder if the honeymoon period where you can do whatever you want in the first year hasn't been true for a long time, just because that's not the modern world.
Well, I think you're right. I think there's this kind of...
Not that I was accusing you of having that sort of rose-tinted view, Chris.
No, but there is this sort of thought process doing the rounds among some corners of people who think that actually, what we've talked about quite a lot as a volatile electorate goes beyond the electorate to actually people in Parliament. Do MPs, are they now less willing to kind of sit and wait and to see how things develop? And are they more prepared to push back when they might think that the leaders of their own party, whatever colour that might be, are taking the wrong approach? Is the volatility in our wider politics having a direct impact on the parliamentary process and how easy or not it is for parties to govern anymore?
Well, it's bound to, really.
Well, a lot of this is about the ability to deal with trade-offs. So, it's all well and good, everyone shouting 5%, hooray, high five, 5%, text messages around the G7 leader WhatsApp group, which one needs to get in to that G7.
Well, you don't need to if Donald Trump has publishes it.
But 1%, a percentage point of GDP, 30 billion a year, there, seriously raises questions about all the other things that we're told you can't do in politics. If you're serious, to be honest, if you're serious about 1% extra of GDP on defence, then I think it brings into question things like the triple lock on pensions, NHS funding, everything. Right now, nobody wants to have that conversation. I tried to get Luke Pollard to just acknowledge that there are some serious decisions here, and people are ready for those decisions. Indeed, it's interesting that in Spain, which was the big fuss in NATO, a centre-left government...
Because Spain refused to sign up, or sign up, or have signed up with the big asterisk to the 5%.
Pedro Sanchez, the Prime Minister, sister party of the Labour Party, said, we cannot go. We're going to stick with 2% because that's more consistent with Spain's welfare system. That's interesting. Now, that is not...
So acknowledging a trade-off.
That is a potential argument that some in the Labour Party, welfare, warfare, maybe that's not everybody. That's the centre of gravity in the Labour Party. But it's interesting to see a Labour Party, sister party, a leader of that, NATO, not quite G7, economy's doing quite well, by the way, in Spain, acknowledging that very clear trade-off. I think people are kind of ready to hear about those trade-offs.
And knowing that in so doing, he would take heat publicly, as he did repeatedly, from President Trump, saying...
You're going to have to pay for it somehow.
You're going to have to pay for it somehow. The trade talks are going to be tricky with you, blah, blah, blah. That's quite curious in the context of the EU, but nonetheless. And so, and he, even, the president's saying, your economy's doing all right. Everybody else is chipping in. Why are you not?
Faisal was talking there about he wishes he was on the WhatsApp group. I think he was referring, were you, Faisal, to the texts that Mark Rutte, the Secretary General of NATO, sent to Donald Trump, and then Donald Trump published in full on Truth Social, where he's just lavishing Trump with praise.
Yes.
Which actually then went a step further, Chris, actually, when they then met.
It did, Daddy Fleming. Yes.
Yes, please.
Well, this is the power of that word, isn't it? So Deborah Haynes of Sky News asked the president actually about this very thing, didn't he? So yes, this was Mark Rutte referring to Donald Trump as daddy, which is quite a thing to do.
Well, except though, my experience of this was through social media on Wednesday afternoon, and I'm like, Mark Rutte has called Donald Trump daddy, which I agree is a word that comes with a lot of, it's very loaded and all sorts of different perspectives. And then I actually watched the clip, and it's not as dramatic as that, because Trump starts off by saying Iran and Israel are, do you know what? I think let's just listen to it, and then newscasters can go through their own process of the dadification of NATO.
Thanks, Daddy.
Stop saying.
They've had a big fight, like two kids in a schoolyard. You know, they fight like hell. You can't stop them. Let them fight for about 2-3 minutes, then it's easier to stop them.
And then Daddy has to sometimes use strong language
You have to use strong language. Every once in a while, you have to use a certain word.
See, I'm torn because Rutte
context.
introduces the daddy. I can't stop saying it either. The daddy concept into the conversation, and and he's a former prime minister of an EU nation, so he knows what he's doing when he opens his mouth.
Yeah, but context is key.
But equally, he was just extending a metaphor that Donald Trump was doing. And of course, if the whole message of the NATO summit was just do whatever it takes to suck up and flatter to Donald Trump, if he goes with a metaphor, you're going to pick it up and run with it.
Yeah, and the thing is, obviously, Mark Rutte had two ways to look at this. Once Donald Trump decided to publish that slightly, I think sycophantic is a fair word to say about that text message, he could either back away from it or lean into it, right?
Yeah.
And I think given what was at stake for a lot of other countries, NATO members at that summit, where, the kind of this constant willy won't he stand with us from Donald Trump, and there was quite clearly, and I know, Chris, you were there, but the whole approach was quite clearly agreed. Let's just get this guy on side. What is the kind of alternative from Mark Rutte apart from... So he, even in his person to person, aside from the daddy thing, he was very flattering. He was very complimentary.
It's classic, and we saw this with Keir Starmer back in the White House in February. It's the sort of mirroring of language, the mirroring of the sort of
Whipping out a letter from the king.
Well, leaning into a bit of the theatrics that we know Donald Trump loves.
But the substance of what he's talking about, it's extraordinary to think that is about the exchange of missiles between Iran and Israel. And his bombing of Iran's nuclear sites, which is something... I mean, it's extraordinary to think that within 3 days... what I'm saying is that how much it has calmed compared to where we thought it might get to, who would have said on Sunday morning that by Wednesday they'll be joking about paternal...
But equally, we learned in that from those exchanges. I don't mean the exchanges where they were all calling each other daddy, but the exchanges between Israel, Iran, and the US and Iran, that actually a lot of it was telegraphed in advance, and the Iranian counterattack was kind of well telegraphed, and the Americans had already moved their planes out of there, just like the Iranians had already moved their enriched uranium out of the facilities.
It
was
what was the vibe?
Didn't he? The Iranians were quite nice about it.
Yes.
Told us what time that they were going to hit us.
What was
get out of the way.
summit? I mean, when you hear stuff like that?
Well, there's a couple of things. So one is the extent to which we're already normalising, just a handful of months into Donald Trump's second term, the informal vernacular from him about the most grave topics. So all this daddy stuff in the context of something that a matter of 48 hours previously was.
World War III.
Well,
he keeps on saying the Iranians did really well and all that. I mean, I just don't get it. What's that about when he's literally sent B-2 bombers in against their nuclear facilities?
Well, I think it's part of it.
They did really well. They fought hard.
And we saw this at NATO. Is that capacity he has to say things that will be wildly contradictory from sort of one moment to the next. Even the act of Donald Trump getting to NATO. So it starts with his effing and jeffing on the grass in Washington. On the plane halfway across the Atlantic, he's equivocal about Article 5, we all defend each other if one person's attacked. The founding central doctrine of NATO, followed by saying, I believe in it once he lands. And then all the stuff around, which, as you say, was Mark Rutte led rather than his, but the whole, all this, daddy stuff. And then the whole choreography of the whole summit, which was basically shrunken down into one morning.
So that he wouldn't walk out.
So that it was impossible to leave early because it was only one morning, effectively, which was all about, perfectly rationally, arguably from the other leaders' perspective, that the management of a wildly unpredictable central character.
And I think it is worth saying, though, the consequences of this move in Europe, we're going to see a massive transformation of the whole European economy now. Factories will open up. factories in Britain will open up to service German
Well, we're
tanks.
going to have 6 new munitions factories. That was in the defence strategy, wasn't it?
Yeah. No, we had a whole load of strategies.
Do you know what I was going to say?
List of
Because
them.
last time we met, Faisal, you
Yeah.
wanted to talk about the infrastructure strategy, and we
did.
sadly ran out of time. Now, the issue is there's been inflation in strategies, because since then
Yes.
we've had a national security strategy, which was
Yeah.
different from the defence review,
Yeah.
and we've had a national industrial strategy.
Yeah.
I'm trying to remember all the
Yes.
strategies. And then today we got a trade strategy.
Yeah.
If you get the box set of all the strategies, is some amazing grand vision revealed to you?
I think they need a strategy.
Okay. You can have either fewer or more.
Well,
Or better.
sew them together and tell the world what your plan is. I think it's all crying out for that right now, and I'm not sure they really did that. They sort of pumped up the industrial strategy a bit. The infrastructure strategy, I don't think we've heard the end of that yet. There was no.
There was an industrial strategy too.
There wasn't. No, I mean, the industrial strategy had something to it. The infrastructure strategy was curiously empty of infrastructure, in the sense that we were waiting for the pipeline of hundreds of projects where they're going to have to make this word trade-offs. Which are the big projects you're going for? Which are the small projects you're going for? They
Who are you
reassured
going to annoy in the areas where the
Yeah.
projects will be built?
because the Conservatives
Or not built.
did
Yeah.
sign up to quite a lot of projects with not a great deal of planning. So there is a list of projects. I don't think they all survive. What happened to this sort of seminal totemic train line between Liverpool and Manchester, which didn't make it into the infrastructure strategy? Everyone's been reassured that, oh no, it's coming.
It was teased several
but
times.
it's not in
as
the
well.
strategy.
Yeah.
And then people are starting to think, is there some game being played? Trade strategy, which came out today. Yeah, I think the government had a moment to telegraph, not to the country, but to the world, about a year in-ish. This is our plan now. And there are some things going in their direction, like signing the deals with India and EU and US. I'm not sure I've seen the whole thing linked together yet.
You can listen to us with your ears every single day on BBC Sounds as a podcast. So bye-bye, you three.
Goodbye.
Bye.
And bye-bye to you at home or wherever you've been listening to us.